kind of nice to have a nice, friendly crowd of people that we already kind of are familiar with. Makes it a little more intimate and a little more relaxed. So that's why we're getting a later start. I'm Nancy Durfee. I'm with the Trustees of Reservations. Back when we knew the conference was coming up, we decided we would put a workshop together that focused on protecting our open spaces through partnerships. We basically wanted to give everyone the opportunity to find out how important it is to reconnect people to their open spaces. And we tried, and we did. We put together, I think, a wonderful speaking group today to kind of talk about not only Justin Hollander from Tufts University talking about his research, but also John Vasconcellos from the trustees and Julie Kelly from Mass in Motion from the city of Fall River. All have had experiences with this, and I think you're going to get a lot of benefit out of what they have done and tried and been successful at. We're going to learn how the partnerships have played a key role in making these things happen, and how each one of these presentations will kind of lead in a thread to the next presentation and the next, and how those partnerships have played out. So I'm going to introduce Justin Hollander, who gave me a very small bio, and I told him, if you're going to do that, then you're going to get the Nancy version. I'm going to have to elaborate. So I had met Justin probably 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, we worked on a project together. And it was about community and about planning. And are we really doing a good job as planners, as getting the word out, asking for feedback, creating that scenario where people can give you great ideas and try to implement those into your project. And so we did a host of different things to do that. And I think we did a pretty good job. I think a lot of the people in the community really felt like that they had been reached. It was in the paper. A lot of people came out for varying different things and parts of the process. And that was a wonderful experience to work with Justin on that. He comes as an assistant professor. Are you still an assistant professor, from what you told me? Still at the Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University, and a research scientist at George Perkins Marsh Institute at Clark University. He's the author of Sunburnt Cities, The Great Recession, Depopulation, and Urban Planning in American Sunbelt, and 2 other books examining the challenges of planning for the post-industrial shrinking cities. So without any more, I'm going to let Justin come up and talk to you about his experiences.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you all for joining us here today. I think what I'm trying to accomplish in my time with you is to talk about some research I've done around vacancy and reuse, historical reuse patterns based on some research I've done. I'm mainly going to talk about New Bedford, but I've been starting a project now in the city of Baltimore, and I'll tell you guys a little bit about some of the stuff I've done there. So I think a lot of the times when people, in an abstract way, think about what does it mean for a place to lose population, lose jobs, shrink, or decline, this is what they think of. They think of the trash-strewn vacant lot in the foreground here. Those are tires, if you couldn't tell. Partially boarded up buildings, partially burned building. Right? This is kind of like the image of what happens when a place loses population, is experiencing decline. I have another image here. So like the rusted fence with the barbed wire, and there's some shack back here, and nobody wants to know what's happening back in that shack. And so like really kind of scary, uncared for, unprotected spaces. In the next slide. So in the urban studies literature, people have really studied this as a problem, and there's been a lot of research about this idea of like a brownfields, or what's called broken windows. Like if places aren't being cared for, then other places aren't going to be cared for. It's going to suggest just a general disequilibrium. And what I've seen in my own experiences is this last point here, that it's the lack of protection and maintenance of these sites, whether it's an abandoned building or vacant lot. If it's not being cared for, it's not being taken care of, then that's really the heart of the problem. And so I asked the question in this project and others, is whether new non-residential uses make sense for some of these sites. And that's kind of where we connect to food production, urban agriculture, and some of the other kind of themes. So I'm going to talk about one specific project that I did here in New Bedford with this question about how a city actually adjusts to depopulation, what actually physically happens to various lots. Using historic map data, Sanborn fire insurance maps were produced here and other big cities at a roughly 10 to 20 year interval, and then I updated it with Google Maps in 2010. So, well, you guys, for anyone who doesn't know where we are, I'm sorry. Next slide.
Sorry. I'm trying to catch the cues.
Next slide.
You want to go on?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for those of you not familiar with some of the demographics, I mean, New Bedford it's not St. Louis. Go Red Sox. It's lost 7% of its population since 1970, where St. Louis since 1970 has probably lost like 30 or 40%. So the scale of the shrinkage or depopulation is more modest, but you can definitely see a trend here. There was a slight tick up from 2000 to 2010, so you might say it's a growing city, but if you look at the long-term trend, there's definitely some patterns here that are pretty significant. And then this is really what you want to pay attention to, things like this, the percent of vacant units, and this idea of vacant other, that's a census category for basically properties that are abandoned. So huge growth in how many of those kinds of sites. And you're also seeing just an overall decline in population density, which is, it's analogous to total population, but you see how there are fewer people per square mile. Next slide. So you want to zoom in. I looked at 3 neighborhoods more closely. No, next slide. We'll zoom in. So the North End, South Central, and Cove Street. Next slide. And this is what a Sanborn fire insurance map looks like. So you have a lot of information. Historians love this kind of stuff. But for me, what I really just cared about was the building footprints. So you see where there was a structure. And I'm really primarily looking at the residential structures in these neighborhoods. But next slide. So this is what Cove Street looked like. And on the upper right-hand corner, you see the time scale as the neighborhood grew. Starting in 1906 was the first map we have. So it kind of grew, it got to reach some sort of apex in around the 30s, and then you start to see like buildings starting to disappear a little bit, kind of like a little modest thinning out. We'll go to the next one, North End, and here it's a little bit more pronounced. By right around 36, you see the peak starts to thin out, and even more so in 2010. And then the last one is the South End and South Central. And what's interesting about this neighborhood from a historical perspective is the urban renewal efforts that, first, building the public housing and large-scale buildings, and then building a highway on the eastern side of the neighborhood. But if you even don't even look at that, and you just look at the western side of the neighborhood, you still see a really detectable thinning out of the residential structures. I'll let it go through one more time. And this one starts in 1888, so it's actually like a much older neighborhood than the other ones. Okay, so next slide. So what I wanted to know was what was happening at those places where there had been a structure and it had disappeared. So this is an example for Cove Street. So I think there were about 14 lots that met that description. And so I numbered them, labeled them, and we did direct observation with my students, just looking at what was at each of those sites. Because we knew there was no building. That we could tell from Google Maps. And so, we photographed and classified the new use. Next slide. So the question is, well, what happened to the land that was that had been a residential use? And the answer is they were absorbed. I use the word absorbed, but they were reused into the urban fabric. These sites where there had been a house, it's it's not a house anymore, but it's being reused. It's reused into the urban fabric. And this 92% in North End, 87 in Coast Street, and 75. So the next question was, well, reused as what? Like, how are they being reused? Next slide. Oh, actually, I just have a little more detail here, if you're interested, just in terms of the numbers. So 27 in South End, 13 in Coast Street, and 22 were at least partially used. So like there may be some part of the site that is still derelict in some way, but some sort of reprogramming. Okay, now next slide. So this is what happened to some of the lots. This is like a pocket park. So here, who's protecting and maintaining it? It's the city. Next slide. Here's another example. This is a process that is about adopting a lot where I'm pretty sure it's the yellow house on the right took ownership of, or took control, maybe not technically ownership of that middle parcel, and they have planted an apple tree in the back. And so they're taking care of the space. And then urban agriculture. I mean, this is really just someone is growing grapes on the metal piping back there, and they're farming it. So these are ways that people are taking ownership. Those are no longer houses anymore. These sites are being reused, reincorporated into the city. Next slide. But those are actually anomalies. Really, most of it's parking. Most of what we saw when we went to where there used to be a building, it's parking spaces, it's driveways. And so, I mean, that makes sense. But there are a few exceptions to that, and so I've indicated there was a religious sanctuary on one of these sites. The next slide. So, I mean, I think it raises, these results raise important questions about what the role of the city is, what private properties are thinking, owners are thinking. Like, how did this happen? What were they motivated by in terms of turning their land into a parking space or turning it into other uses? And is this a good thing? Should we be celebrating this? Should we be trying to emulate it? So I'm inclined to think so, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, and we can talk about this more. But I wanted to now move on, next slide, to Baltimore. Just tell you about another way that I've studied this kind of phenomenon. And you know, Baltimore is a very different city than New Bedford, both in scale and form. And it's cities comprised, at least the parts that I'm interested in, are comprised primarily of row houses. And so what you see on the right is an example of where there's a long row house, and then they demolish the last, looks like 2 units. And so you have this kind of green space on the end cap. Next slide. So Baltimore has around 15 to 20,000 abandoned buildings. And so, you know, this is a place of like the scale of the problem is really severe. Next slide. So there's 3 things that are happening in Baltimore that are really important. And one is called the Vacant Values Program, which is a proactive effort by the part of the city to look at the fact that they have a lot of vacant lots and abandoned buildings, and to say that the city may grow, the city may start to increase in population. That's something they would like to happen as part of their planning efforts. But in the meantime, we need to take active role in reprogramming. And so there are a couple different programs they have. The first one I wanted to talk about was the farmer lease program. So they pre-qualify farmers to participate in active farming. The sites have to be at least an acre large, and it's intended for a for-profit use. And so where I came in is working with the city of Baltimore. We got a grant from a local foundation, and we have been helping them to think about, given the scale of the decision-making problem, how might we be able to help them? So I'm partnering with a colleague of mine. He's a professor at UMass Boston, and he does operations research. So it's the kind of the math, science behind making decisions. So next slide. So this is what we did. We looked at, this is just one of our drafts. We're not quite finished with the project yet. But in thinking about like, well, what do you emphasize if you have to like optimize your decision making? What do you care about? And so what we focused on was 3 primary uses. They want to maximize the amount of land available for urban agriculture, for that lease farming program. Maximize the amount of land available for stormwater management. So a lot of these vacant lots can be used for stormwater infiltration. And the last one is to maximize the amount of land that can be available to promote new development. So it doesn't have to be today or tomorrow, but there's land that's strategic, and that if you can hold on to it, then that would make sense for the future. So we created these different scenarios and tried to emphasize, what if you put all of your emphasis on one versus the other? We also had this other goal of eliminating the just plain blight. Like, how do you reduce the amount of just vacancy and abandoned buildings as a kind of criteria? And so what you see here on the right is a solution map that came up for one, and the green are the sites that were selected for urban agriculture, the blue for stormwater, and the yellow for new development. So what it does is it helps the city have a conversation within themselves about what's really important, and this is one way to help identify that. So in terms of thinking about policy going forward, I mean, I think that there are some things that cities can do and activists can do to help push this kind of agenda forward, to try to get cities to do a better job of thinking about how this kind of land can be reused. One idea that I've been writing and studying a little bit is I call it relaxed zoning. It's about looking at these kinds of places and where this process seems to be at work. Maybe their zoning doesn't have to be quite so strict. Explore the potential for non-residential uses. Now, I work outside of Boston. Boston wouldn't be considered a shrinking city, but there are parts of Boston that have trouble economically and are in decline. So the city introduced, not because of that, but they introduced an urban agriculture zoning ordinance to allow people to actively farm in the city. But I mean, it was just so hard to get this thing through, and it's still so labor intensive for anyone to try to do it. So what I'm offering here is another way for cities to think about this, to provide an overlay to just have as a condition, if a neighborhood starts to experience the kind of problems that start to generate vacant lots and abandoned buildings, right off the bat, start to open up, allow urban agriculture, allow stormwater management in some cases, and provide all of the kind of range of different types of uses that we talked about earlier around parking, around other types of uses. So these are ways that cities can be more kind of proactive and build into their development code the ability to be flexible. So during times of growth and decline, that you're going to maintain a high quality of life for the people who are there. Thank you for your attention. Just,
do you want to take a few questions now
yeah.
while I pull up the other show? That's great.
So in the second to last slide, I think, where you had the blue for the stormwater, green for urban ag, how much of that decision making is a participatory process with people that live there? Because say like the image of that pocket park that got put in theory, like it's always a great idea, but like you said, if no one maintains it, it becomes as useless as an empty lot in cases. So is part of your process like getting in and including like people that are living there to help design the space that might be useful?
Yeah, so the decision modeling exercise is a pilot. We're just working within the city, and it's not going to, the results are not going to be incorporated into any actual decision making. They wanted to see kind of how it worked, but we are in the midst of a proposal to try to develop it like this for real and do it citywide and with a community participation component. That's the aim. Right now, it's just like an internal exercise to see, is this going to relate at all to the decisions we made? That's from the city's perspective.
If you look at land use plans of the city of New Bedford, for example, over time, you can see that there is a covering up or a piping a lot of the watershed systems that were here, streams and wetlands and floodplains and so on. So is part of your process to re-examine, the former floodplains and perhaps try and put those back to use again?
That's part of what I think the answer is, and I think that's what the city of Baltimore sees as well, and they have their own piping problems. But yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at a lot of vacant lots in an area where there's an aging infrastructure, then that's an obvious possible solution.
And one other question is about tax code. New Bedford is a fairly expensive city to live in with its tax rates. Do you have some sort of incentives for people to become new frontiersmen and women and recolonize the city?
Yeah, I mean, like a homesteading provision. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of cities experiment with. But I wouldn't want to tell a city that that's something they have to do, because you always have this fiscal problem of how do you continue to maintain enough income coming in through tax receipts while a place loses tax base. So I mean, so I think that those are questions that cities really need to struggle with, though. That's a good question.